I'm Khursheed Wadia, and I'm Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Warwick. And my research centers on the political participation and civic engagement of women from minority communities, and also on how gendered policy impacts on these populations of women. And the countries that I have focused on over many years are Britain and France. And recent projects that I've had funding for include an ESRC funded project on women from Muslim communities in France and Britain and their political participation. And another project that was funded by the British Academy was on forced marriage policy and looking at which actors contribute to that policy making and implementation, and what the impacts of that policy are on women from minority communities. So that's me, yes.
So from your perspective and experience, how much progress has been made in the pursuit of gender equality in academia?
So from my introduction, you will have gleaned that I'm not an expert on gender in academia. So I am drawing on my own experiences as a woman of color, and also on my experiences as a union caseworker over 13 years, during which time I've seen some awful cases of discrimination against women academics. So what I would say is that since I first started working in higher education, which was a long time ago, opportunities for women have improved considerably, and this is really good news. So when I first started in higher education, as far as I remember, there were few, if any, women professors, and especially in my field, which is political science, because traditionally political science has been a very, very masculine field. So I started in a new university in a politics department, and there was only one other woman in the department apart from me. And we were the most junior in the department, and we rarely got heard. And if we talked louder in order to be heard, we were actually told in the typical way of male banter that ultimately stings really hard, to behave ourselves and to stop acting like harridans. That was actually the words that were used. And I also remember going to my first Political Studies Association conference as a PhD student, where panels were all male, basically, just about. And there were a few women like Elizabeth Meehan, who was deemed credible enough to grace a plenary panel. And I think there was one gender panel that was organized by Johnny Lovendusky or Vicky Randall. So that was my experience when I first joined. So how do things look like today in comparison? Well, today I work in a university in which women form equal or almost equal numbers in most arts, humanities, and social sciences departments. And they form at least a critical mass in departments like maths and engineering and science, applied science type departments. My own department, which is sociology, is an outlier because women are in the majority. And of the women colleagues that I have, there are 4 women professors out of 9 professors in total, and of these 3 are women of color. So but sociology really isn't typical, a typical department. And picking up another point that I mentioned earlier about conferences, if you look at mainstream conferences today, you'll find that either all male panels are not allowed, or they are very strongly discouraged. But having said that, in the main, conferences, including gender conferences, remain very white. Now, in addition to how university departments and conferences look in terms of gender, there have been other improvements, obviously. So for example, maternity and caring leave, and I'm just picking out examples here and there. Maternity and caring leave are taken a lot more seriously, and teaching and related jobs have become a lot more integrated into promotion structures, and measures of esteem are a lot more flexible, so that the gendered prestige economy that you have within higher education has opened up a little bit more to let women academics in greater numbers. And then, of course, gender equality has also become a very investable thing for higher education institutions. And people will have heard of the Athena Swan Charter Mark, which is sought by universities and their departments across the UK. And it has meant that universities have put a fair amount of time and money on developing gender policies and initiatives. And I read this morning, because I was just looking through some figures, that there are about 160 universities in the UK which are members of the Athena Swan Charter, and that between them all, they hold over 760 institutional and departmental awards, which range from bronze to gold. So these are some examples of how things have changed as far as gender equality is concerned. And I think, although I've drawn closely on the example of my own university and working there, it's a pretty close reflection of what's happening across the sector.
What do you think are the issues that are still pressing in the area of gender in academia, and how might these be addressed?
So, although in terms of counting numbers, things have improved, we know that numerical equality doesn't ever tell us the whole story. So if, again, drawing on my own experience and working at the University of Warwick, if I look across at the social sciences faculty, although I haven't counted, people up exactly, I'd say that women account for about 30 to 40% of the academic staff. But having said that, I don't know who's part-time versus who's full-time, who's on a fixed-term contract or an hourly paid contract as opposed to an indefinite contract. And I think that that kind of knowledge is a lot more telling about improvements in gender equality. And I'll try not to throw too many figures out, mainly because I haven't got all that many at hand. And so really, I will rely on the perfectly good method of what we know. So what we know that women make up the majority of academics on precarious contract, that is to say hourly paid contracts, 0 hours contracts, fixed term contracts, and so on and so forth. And that they find themselves in this type of employment due to the burden, due to bearing the burden of childcare, of the care of elderly relatives if they have them, the burden of housework, and so on and so forth, in order to allow families and society to function. And we know that working in these precarious conditions is unlikely to lead to opportunities for stable employment in the long run, for which you normally have to show an excellent record of publication or innovation in teaching and so on, okay? We also know that our women colleagues, even those with partners who claim to be feminist, who have young children, are unable to jet off to international conferences, to become part of useful networks, to apply for large research grants, and so on and so forth. And I mentioned maternity leave being and care leave being taken more seriously, but even though it's taken more seriously now than it was, say, 20 years ago, it can still create gaps in women's research trajectories. And that can then be seen as a weakness. Some institutions like Warwick, and I know that there are others as well, to try and make up for the lost time that goes into maternity leave and so on, are giving women the opportunity to apply for returners leave, returners research leave, and that is for up to 1 year. But having said that, it's the opportunities offered, but it's not getting it is not automatic. And the other thing is that it's not something that's offered systematically across the higher education sector. The other thing is that we know that women academics, a lot more than men, are given student-facing roles, are given teaching-related admin roles, which are less valued when it comes to promotion processes. And again, I did say before that things are changing, that teaching is getting a lot more valued, especially innovation in teaching is getting a lot more valued when it comes to promotion, but more of that needs to happen. And then, of course, we know that there is a gender pay gap in the UK higher education sector. And I've got a figure for 2018 where it stood at 15.9%. And it was at that time the highest of all EU countries when we were still in the EU at that point. And the figure really has only gone down to 15% today. So it hasn't improved a huge amount. And in fact, in 46 institutions out of the 220 odd which sent data, things have got worse in terms of the gender pay gap. So these are some of the structural barriers and problems which continue to exist in academia for women. And it becomes clear that although you have these 760 plus Athena Swan Awards, which have been given out to institutions and to departments up and down the country, that structural issues aren't being tackled by the universities. And I would say that there's really no willingness to do that, because you've got the marketization of universities. Universities are trying to act like private sector institutions. And also universities ultimately are operating in a patriarchal society, and they reflect those norms. So what I'd say is that while universities have learned to talk the talk, there is a massive gap between discourse and practice. And of course, in all of this, I haven't even mentioned so far the position of academics of color, of women academics of color in particular. We haven't spoken about women students and the gender attainment gap, and we haven't touched on the issue of everyday sexism, everyday racism that affects women in academia. But if I can just say a little bit more before we move on to the next question about women academics of color, then it's worth listening to them. They would argue that improved gender equality that has happened over the last 20 years or more in higher education has mainly benefited white middle-class women who have gained positions as professors, academic managers, and vice chancellors. And if you only look at these few positions at the top, you find, for example, and here I will give you some figures, that while white women make up 24% of professors in this country, women of color only make up 2.1%, and that out of the 40 women vice chancellors that we have in the UK, only two are women of color. And I can name them. There's Valerie Amos, who is Master of University College, Oxford, and there's Minouche Shafiq, who is the director of LSE. I don't know, I think that is accurate. I might be wrong, there might be some change more very, very recently. But universities in the UK remain overwhelmingly white. In 2018, 2019, the Higher Education Statistics Agency figures showed that of those whose ethnicity was known, 83% were white, 10% were Asian, and only a tiny 2% were Black or mixed race. So for many women of color, UK academia is a closed world. And when they do manage to prise the door open, they are invisibilized, or they face overt sexism and racism, and the structural barriers for them are even higher than for white women. So yeah, those are the kind of barriers that still exist for women in higher education today. And although there have been efforts made to overcome those barriers and to encourage women to progress in their chosen field, there's not really enough being done. And from the work that I've done as a union caseworker, I could quote loads and loads of examples of discrimination.
Looking back, what advice, if any, would you give to your doctoral student or early career self on the issue of gender and gender equality in academia?
Okay, so I've been in higher education for an awful long time. So the experience that I have built up is quite a lot. And therefore I have a lot of things that a lot of advice that I could give to my doctoral student self of many years ago. And I'll just throw out a few bits of advice, and they're not in any order of importance. But I would say, for example, be very bold. And that is a difficult thing to do, but you've got to push yourself, and you've got to ask for what you think you are entitled to, for what you think you are worth yourself. So that is really important. And don't believe in promises made by male, sometimes female bosses, that your turn will come, but that you aren't experienced yet because to take on a course development role or become a co-investigator on a grant application, and all sorts of stuff, which I've been told. That your time's not yet. I think you have to insist, but of course with that insistence you have to have the evidence which you place in front of the manager in question, and you've got to push for it. So that's one piece of advice. The other thing that I've been told is that I don't fit a particular leadership model. And that leadership model that is dominant in higher education is a male model of leadership. It's very, very hierarchical. And so what I would say is that you've got to think of alternative models of leadership, and then really work on those models and push for those models with help from trusted colleagues. So that's another kind of thing. The other thing that's really important is network. Network inside your department, network outside of your department, network outside of your university, so that you become known. Because very often you will get support in terms of career progression from people who are outside of your university. That kind of pressure can work as well. So the networking thing is really important, and gathering as many allies as possible as you can within your own institution and outside of your institution. Another thing that I would say is that if you're very, very clearly discriminated against, don't put up with it. And if you're in danger of losing your job, that really is something that is very, very doesn't happen very, very often, but it often enough for it to be worrying. So if you're really clearly discriminated against and in danger of losing your job, do lodge a grievance, do seek help from the union, do lodge a grievance, and then persist. That is really important, because my experience is that these kind of processes are drawn out so that, you know, what HR departments and bosses hope for is that you get so fed up that you leave or you withdraw. But if you have to persist, because actually HR departments I found to be quite lazy, and they assume that you don't know much, especially if you're a woman of color, while academic managers can be quite arrogant and they assume that you won't stay the course. So, and I speak from personal experience. So you know, do that if it's necessary, and then persist. And then sort of, I guess, on a more kind of, it's not light, it is important, but it's not as heavy as going for a grievance. But I think in meetings, if you're making if you're not being heard, you have got to very politely push yourself forward, but make sure that your interventions are thoughtful, that they're forceful, and that they are supported by evidence. In other words, don't speak for the sake of it, because as a woman, you're never going to be heard in the same way as your male colleague who may be making utterly pointless comments. So those are just kind of bits of advice thrown in a bit of a jumble, but there you go.
So looking forward, how might the pandemic affect issues around gender in academia?
So unfortunately, I'm quite pessimistic about this. So looking forward, I don't see a whole lot of improvements in gender equality in academia. From anecdotal evidence and from very early research findings, we see that COVID has confirmed the extent of the use of Deliveroo type contracts that universities use, and that many of those contracts which pre-pandemic were offered to women were very abruptly ended when COVID-19 struck, as it were. So I think that kind of the use of those kind of contracts is going to continue, because it showed university managers that they were convenient, that when you had a sudden crisis like COVID, those contracts could be disposed of very, very easily. Okay. The other thing that the pandemic has cast a spotlight on is who gets to do research and who gets to publish in times of a crisis. Okay. And over the past year, a number of women academics have written of their experiences in the mainstream media, but also in academic journals and so on, about their experiences of working from home in lockdown, and having found that looking after children, trying to homeschool them, and so on and so forth, is completely at odds with doing any kind of meaningful research. So in the short space of a year, a glaring disparity has emerged between academics who have children and those who don't have children or who have grown-up children. And then within this, there's a further inequality between among heterosexual parents, working from home parents, and unsurprisingly, it's women who have borne the greatest responsibility for children in lockdown. And there are testimonies from women of only being able to write for publication very, very early in the morning or very late in the evening. And that's if they haven't got, you know, other work commitments on their plate. And really, this kind of working pattern isn't sustainable if you're going to publish high quality research. So there have been reports of submissions from women to scholarly journals dropping off since March 2020. And the deputy, Elizabeth Hannon, the deputy leader, editor of the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, basically tweeted, I think she tweeted and said that she'd noticed that the number of article submissions to the journal had gone down. And she was absolutely overwhelmed with responses from women academics from this country and elsewhere, saying that, you know, they just couldn't work in the lockdown because of childcare responsibilities and so on and so forth. And then, of course, during this period of the pandemic, academic journals have used new strategies for accelerated peer review. Bodies like the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, have increase the quantity and speed of data that they're producing. Research councils have put in fast calls for grant applications and so on and so forth. And all of these kind of accelerated procedures are just cutting out women academics because of their childcare and home responsibilities, because you can't respond to those kind of accelerated calls, etc., etc., if you have children and you're trying to work from home. And so you know, that's one of the impacts in terms of who's doing the research and what kind of publications, what kind of journals they're publishing in. We haven't kind of gone far enough out of the pandemic. We haven't gone out of the pandemic, but we haven't gone even far enough through it to know what the long-term impacts will be. But I suspect that the pandemic will have acted in very much the kind of way that, say, maternity leave acts, or in that it stops the trajectory of women, the career trajectory of women. It creates a gap, and it therefore leads to perceived weaknesses in their CVs, and that doesn't bode well for career progression, basically. In terms of what can be done about it, I haven't really given it a lot of thought, but it's something that, you know, we're going to have to deal with.